a special announcement. We are heading to RSA conference in San Francisco for our 11th years of coverage, April 28th, May 1st.
And as always, we'll bring you keynotes, conversations with organizers, speakers, industry leaders, plus the latest insights from the world of cybersecurity.
And we'll reconnect with old friends, meet new ones, and of course, we want you and your company to join us.
We have a few spots left for full sponsorship and our on-location briefings. You can book yours now at itspmagazine.com/RSAC.
We're going.
And you're coming with us.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Audio Signals Podcast, where we talk about storytelling and storytellers, which are the one that tells the story. And as I always say, it's about many things that we do in life, especially when they're creative things, but also when we go around and we present ourselves in a certain way. The way we dress, we tell a story. The way we talk, we tell a story. And of course, then there is the profession of telling stories. And that's writers, photographers, painters, songwriter, and videographer. There are also journalists. In our case, is my guest, Robin Hamilton, and she has a lot of story to share. And we're going to talk about something that I think is the first time that we get to the stories from this angle, which is the documentary side of things and how important it is to maybe promote social changes, which is something that I'm really passionate about. So I think it's enough. Robin, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marco. I'm thrilled to be here. I really, really appreciate it. And I feel so fortunate. I'm one of the first. So that makes me feel like, pretty special.
You can you can get it started from these angles, I would say,
Yes.
So I'm excited about that. So let's start with that. I like to ask the first question that don't take it too philosophical, but who is Robin?
Yes, thank you. Good question. I did my homework. I heard other authors who answered, and some of them went on these long-winded answers. So for me, I'll just say I am a filmmaker, a journalist, a passionate storyteller who's curious about life and the world and what makes people tick. And on a personal level, I'm a wife, a sister, a daughter, and a doggy mommy.
There you go. I got 3, so there you go.
Oh, good for you, right? You fall in love with them.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that's a good start. But as you say, and I mentioned at the beginning, you also started as a journalist.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important piece of the story, because being a journalist and telling a story as a journalist, I feel like it's not necessarily the same thing as telling a story from a creative perspective. But I think you can mix the two and be a better storyteller because of that. My opinion.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on. Well, I will say that as a journalist, you do have to be creative. You're explaining something to the public in a way where you have facts. So you don't want to manipulate that. But what you can do is be creative in the way you present it to the public so that it can engage people. If it's something that maybe is on the more drier side, but is important, you can find a way to make it more appetizing. There are ways to be really creative as a journalist. I remember I was working as a reporter years ago, and I was doing broadcast news, broadcast television. So we would often have a 5, a 6, and an 11. Or if you worked the morning shift, you would have a 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. news hit, as they would say, and then another at noon. And what often happens is you have to cover one specific story and tell it in a specific time frame, often a very short time frame. And I would have to be creative about how I told the story, where did I get my sound bites from, and how could I use words that were a little bit more creative. So I would carry, one of the photographers made fun of me because I would carry a thesaurus with me whenever I was trying to find new ways to find different vocabulary words to spice up something that often seemed mundane. Things like a busted water pipe that would close a street, and you would have to tell the same story at 5, 6, 7, and noon. And it does force you to think on your feet. It does force you to be creative. So there is some creativity there. But the reason why I pivoted to filmmaking was because I was finding myself doing a lot of either crime and weather, which is very much of a grind when you are doing local news. And I occasionally would be telling human interest stories, great feature stories, but those were very few and far between. Therefore, I decided I really want to break out and do longer form pieces where I can uncover stories that maybe people aren't talking about, aren't thinking about, people who did amazing things in history and activated social change. I thought those were the stories that deserved being covered, and I wanted to find a new way to put those stories out into the world.
Were you inspired by some other storytellers that did this in the past, either as a writer? I mean, there are many examples of people that made changes possible because of that. And is there anybody you were looking up to while you decided to pursue this career?
It's interesting. I didn't really think of anybody else who had made a transition in this way. That was hard for me to find. And I still haven't really found anybody who did things quite the way that I did. But what I will say is that I kept finding stories of people who just weren't being covered. And I felt more compelled to share their stories in with the tools that I had. And it was really the subjects that inspired me,
Right.
not people who are in the same industry, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, no. I mean, and I didn't necessarily think about somebody that was a journalist and turned it
Yes.
into a filmmaker, but other filmmaker that have made important documentary for creating changes and social changes that you may have
Yes.
looked up to.
Yes. Yes, I have to say, I'm a big fan of Ava DuVernay. I think she's
Mm.
such a talented filmmaker. She's so thoughtful, and she really does create work that does make you think and that does
Mm.
inspire change. So that is someone that off the top of my head. And ironically enough, she started in news herself. She was
See,
an associate producer. Yeah,
there you
yeah.
go.
She had started off as a producer
We find
and
the
pivoted.
connection right
Yes,
there. All right, so tell
that's right.
me about your first project, maybe,
Yeah.
and the others that you've done. I know you actually got an Emmy award
Oh, thank you.
for
Yeah,
your creation, for your creative
thank you.
input, and yeah, so we can get a flavor as the
Yeah.
audience of what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. My first film was This Little Light of Mine, The Legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer. And that film is about the civil rights activist, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who grew up in Mississippi, extremely poor, didn't have more than a sixth grade education. And she was thought to be destined to pick cotton for the rest of her life. And then workers from the North came down during the 1950s and activated people to learn about their rights as citizens, to learn about the importance of the right to vote. I learned about her story because I was in undergrad, I was in college, and I read this book by Kay Mills, This Little Light of Mine, the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, rather, the life of Fannie Lou Hamer. And I was so impressed and moved by what this woman had done with all of the odds that were stacked against her. And I started my journey as a reporter after college, but it was one of those things where a figure or character can get stuck in your mind and they don't let you go. That's how I describe Mrs. Hamer. She just got into my soul and just stayed with me. And the odd thing is, I would meet people who knew her. I had worked as a reporter in Boston. And in 2004, when I was still early reporting in my career, I had met people who had been with her when she testified in for the Democratic National Credentials Committee at the 1964 um, conference. And when I was in Boston, it was celebrating the 40th anniversary of that moment. And so I was meeting people who actually knew her. So her story kept coming up in my life. And then I met someone who had actually gone to jail with her when she was fighting for social justice. And I finally said, I really want to interview you. I want to do something. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know if it's a screenplay or something. And I had tried a screenplay, and you had a guest on earlier who was really entrenched in the screenplay life. He was a really fascinating interview. And I just didn't have that type of experience and exposure. So what I did was I said, I'll make a documentary because the screenplay wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't connected well enough. And I reached back out to this person, and he had passed away. And that's when I realized I have to hold on to this piece of history and tell her story before other people who knew her, worked with her, lived with her aren't available to tell her story either. And what's significant about doing this film about Mrs. Hamer is that in this country, you can see all of the things that she fought for are still very much in danger today, whether it's women's rights, voting rights, labor rights, fair wages, feeding the hungry. They were all stories that she was fighting so hard for, issues she was fighting so hard for that we are still facing today. So often people ask me, why is it important to tell her story? Why is it important to kind of stick to this history lesson? And because I think not knowing your past, you are unprepared for the present and the future. You need to know what people were up against. And she's also a source of inspiration.
Mm.
Whenever you get very discouraged, I have her as a beacon in my room. I have a big poster in my room of her because she stands as someone who represents resilience and determination at almost any cost.
Yeah. So you decided to talk about someone that you really admire, and I'm
Yes.
not going to say comes easy, but definitely the passion is there,
Yeah.
right? So
Yes.
which brings me to, it's kind of like what you said at the beginning, even telling the news about local crime or the weather or wherever it is, you were trying to give a different your own angle, right? So
Yes.
your own creative and way of telling the story, because again, I talk a lot with people in my other podcast, maybe, that are science communicator, like
Yes.
people like Carl Sagan,
Oh,
that
yeah.
is not just, which is one of my favorite ever, because he
Yeah.
knew how to just grab the attention and tell a story and
Yes.
makes understandable something like astrophysics, which people would just be like,
Yes.
what? I don't have the
That's
brain
right.
for that, but you do. So there
That's
is a
right.
way that you tell a story and it resonates,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So my thing is, when you decided to tell this story, um, you need to decide which angle am I going to take. What's the
Hmm.
metaphor maybe that I'm going
Hmm.
to go with? It's not just about here's the mic talk,
Yes.
right? It's
Right.
and then you're doing visually, so you need to think about the shots. You need to think about the
Yes.
lights. Tell me
Yes.
about that process.
Hmm. Well, what I do is I start thinking about who is the center of this story and then who is orbiting around this figure. And in my research, I found incredible pictures because you do have to think about the visuals. The visuals matter.
Hmm.
So I researched pictures and old interviews that she was in, and pictures of or scenes from during that time. And then I found people who knew her. And one of my most favorite interviews was a woman who was a student at the time, and she's now in her 70s. And she had pictures of when she was a young lady in college on a sharecropping field interviewing people to help them register to vote. And she had very vivid stories of what Mrs. Hamer was like. So I thought about how visually people would be making an impact in the story. And then I did certain things like you think about the type of lighting, the mood lighting that you want. You want something that's not too dark because her story is hopeful. It's
Mm.
it's
Yeah, yeah,
painfully
love that.
sad, but she's someone who provides a lot of hope. And then with the music, I know that with some of your other colleagues, you've talked about music, which I really appreciate. I wanted the score to be more piano because the piano, there are different tones in the piano pieces that I have throughout. So everybody uses bluegrass when they talk about the South, like the blues, bluegrass when they talk about the
Hmm.
South. And I just feel like that's so cliche. And for telling Mrs. Hamer's story, I wanted something that showed strength, but also a fragility, and
Mm.
also um, an elegance about her, because there was something that was very resilient and strong and stately about this woman. And that's how I fused all of those elements of what you hear, see, and feel when you're putting that story together. And then I got a great tip from a wonderful story editor who unfortunately has since passed away, Louis Erskine. He was wonderful. He told me, when you put a film together, think about who you want to hear from the most. Who is it that you want to hear from? And it was Mrs. Hamer, of course. And so he would have me lay out my scenes with little post-it notes and with different colors. And Mrs. Hamer would be put in the little map of where my scenes were laid out. And
Mm.
if I didn't have enough of the right color of her post-it notes, that means she was getting lost in other people talking about her versus just hearing from her. So if does that make sense?
It does make sense to me. I mean,
Okay.
people don't think about all the details that goes behind.
Yes.
And I through my wife, actually, I am connected to the movie industry as well, and it
Mhm.
blows my mind the things I've learned that happen behind the
Yeah.
camera, right?
Yes.
And that you don't think about when you're watching the final product, which is also a
No.
very important things to talk about, is
Yes.
all that goes behind. But then
That's
in the
right.
end, people shouldn't be worried about that. They need to
That's
be
right.
immersed in the story, right? But there is so
Exactly.
many details: the music, the light, the
That
photography, the angle, that
exactly.
everything. Yeah, so it makes sense.
Yes. Yes. And I appreciate you saying that, because so much thought goes behind it, but you want it to be so good that nobody thinks about it. You don't even
Right.
realize it. You're right. And
Yep.
so if someone's talking about it, then that means maybe you didn't do something right.
Right. Unless they're expert and they're critics and they're
Exactly.
really like
Exactly.
dissecting what you did,
Right.
right?
That's
Which
right.
could be a good thing.
Right.
Um, how about the other project that you've done?
Mhm.
Because I know you
So,
talk often about women, and
yes.
so that's a choice. But
Yes.
what else?
Yes. Well, it's funny. I didn't plan on doing films only about women, but it just so happened that so often their stories are muted or forgotten. So
Yeah.
I ended up, that's how I found out about Mrs. Hamer. I did one about Mary Church Terrell, who was a suffragette in Washington, D.C. at the turn of the century, and she helped desegregate lunch counters. I did a story about two artists in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., who recreate these doll houses, these miniatures, to show the friendship, love, community that they created. And the backdrop was against Jim Crow. So it's almost like watching little figures tell the story of history. So
Like
you have this
that.
juxtaposition of adult issues but childlike innocence. And then my favorite, I shouldn't say my favorite, all of my films are my favorites, but I did one about Odessa Madre. The film is called Odessa's Reign, and she was a 1950s gangster. She was a numbers runner who became one of the wealthiest women in DC during that time, running a really lucrative underground lottery. And what I thought was so fascinating about her was that she was a very smart woman, but conventionally she did not look like she belonged to the socioeconomic class that she was a part of. And there were also limited opportunities for Black women. She was also gay. She was also very heavyset. And so she had all of these issues. I hate saying the issues because they were just traits, but they were
Yeah, they're
considered
not
bad traits
issues.
at the
Yeah.
time. Right,
Yeah.
right. But they were considered flaws at the time. But she had a brilliant mind. And with those skills, she carved out this life for herself. And she was able to embody this bravado, this strength that rivaled a lot of other, gangsters in the area. People called her the Black Al Capone in DC. Right. And so she's fascinating. She's a fascinating character. And I think there's a lot to be learned about her, not to glamorize crime, but to talk about what makes somebody tick, and also what happens when you leave talent behind. She was incredibly talented, and if she had other means, who knows what she could have been.
Right. I think that's an important angle, because you can look at the story from different angle. And this is actually an interview I did with a musician. He's a classic guitar player, a really, really good one. And we were talking about the fact that when you play a song, you play 3 different songs. Now I'm going to try to remember it correctly. Like, one is the way you play it, and one is the original song, maybe if you're doing a classical piece.
Yes.
And then the other one is what people perceive, because the audience may hear a different story than one you're having in your head. And I think you can apply that to music, but also to what people are going to get when they see your documentary. So people that look at your documentary and watch it, and as on the gangster, may be finding, oh, why is she talking about somebody that is a gangster? Well, you're not getting the point. Right? The point is, she had talent, and as you said, she could have applied and given the opportunity somewhere else. So that must be some kind of frustrating in for every creative person that is telling a story, to think like, how am I going to do it in a way that everybody get my point, but without dumping it down so much that I lose all the creativity and my own view. Like, where did you draw a line?
That's a great question. And that's why I love listening to your podcast, because a number of the authors that you have talked about, writing authentically from your heart, but also how do you appeal to, a mass audience, and what do you do? What is the fine line between, making it work? And I still haven't quite figured that out, because at the end of the day, you do have to make something that people will see. The irony is that when I first did the film about Mrs. Fannie Lou, I didn't really know if anybody was going to see it. I was probably still going to be reporting, and I thought, I just want this to be a love letter for her, and if it gets on a local station, I'll be happy. Right. And it ended up getting picked up nationally and going on PBS throughout the country, which was such a great win. And the same was with Odessa's Reign. What was funny about that was someone had the audacity to write to me and send me a nasty email about, why are you glorifying and glamorizing a woman who made all this money off crime? And she hadn't even seen the film yet. She just saw an ad for it. She hadn't even seen it. But that's a really good question. And I think the hardest thing too is when you write from your heart, you really have to be okay not taking so many things personally. Yeah. And you have to let that go. That's why I was fascinated with the author that wrote the book for his daughter who was at camp. He wrote, do you remember that?
He wrote a letter to her.
Yeah, he wrote
stories
a letter
every night.
Yeah. And he said, I'm not even going to think about what other people are thinking. I just want her to like it. It was
a one-on-one, right?
Yes, It was a one-on-one. And there is something to be said with, if you're just writing from your heart, that's the most authentic thing you can do. And yes, it may hurt if other people criticize it, but if you're coming from a really genuine place, then that's really what matters.
Robin, there's always going to be those people.
I know.
It's always going to be, you go to the best restaurant in the world with the best chef, and they're going to say, I would have put another ingredient in there. You know what? Well, then go cook it yourself.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well,
Right.
that's obviously it's kind of like when you do a statistic. That's you eliminate that. You eliminate
Yes.
the really good comment too, and then you see what most of them say. But I
Yes.
think you were successful with that because honestly, you didn't think about much about the audience. You tell the story the way you want it to,
Thank you.
and that's
Yes.
what people probably appreciated. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And that's how I try to go through my decisions on who I pick as a subject or how I figure out what my next creative pursuit is going to be. It's what really speaks to me, what
yeah.
really is
Now,
in my
sorry,
soul.
you do direct this as well, right?
Yes. Yes, I did. Yes.
What's your background there? Did you just went out there and did it,
I
or
did.
I love it.
I did, and I have
I
to
love it.
say, people have asked, "Oh, did you have imposter syndrome?" And the answer is no, because I used to, when I was a reporter, I did used to think, "Oh, am I not this or that?" And I was never very good at kissing ass.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't, I wasn't making it up the corporate ladder. I just didn't do, like, I can be pleasant and professional, but I'm just not going to suck up. And
Mm-hmm.
I just got tired of people telling me I wasn't enough. And so when I finally got an opportunity to do this story with Mrs. Hamer, I figured, well, I've already had the training as a reporter. I know what it's like to work under tight deadline and keeping things engaging with the public as a journalist
Yeah.
and putting images to words together and doing all that. And I'll just treat this as a really long feature piece. Long, I say, a half hour. That's what I've done. A half hour is long when you've worked in local news and your pieces have to be a minute and a minute and a half. So a
Right.
half hour was long for me, but I felt like I already know how to do this. And what really confirmed that was when I would go to certain film festivals and I would be sitting on panels and people would be all puffed up talking about what they did. And no one had the same experience that I had. I wasn't meeting anybody who had had to transfer their skills over to film in that way. So when people were saying, "Oh, it took me 8 years to do this film," or whatever, and I'm thinking, I don't want to spend 8 years on just one thing. Like, I want to get it out to the world. I want to
I
do
love
that.
it. I
Yeah.
love it. I mean, you have it inside, and you have the
Thank
experience to
you.
do it, but you also have, it's kind of like that. I don't know. You have it. You either
Thank
have it
you.
or you don't have it. I mean, you can learn
Thank you.
things, but
Yes.
absolutely, you can always get better. There's always going to be somebody to
Yes.
teach you things, but if you have that inside you, you'll know, right? You'll
Yes.
know. So,
Yeah.
you think you're gonna apply this to something like I don't know, a feature film? Are you tempted by experiencing a like a more complex storytelling?
I am. That's a great question. I actually am, Marco. I have the bug. I just don't know. I haven't quite figured out where I want to take the leap, if that makes sense. But I
Mm,
am. I mean, one of the things people ask me so often is when I did Odessa's Rain, "Oh, is that going to be a feature? Oh, are you going to make that a feature length film, a live action film? Oh, is it going to become a book?" Um, and so I've thought a lot about what I want to do with her because she's another one where I learned about her just walking through the streets of Washington, D.C. I had a little bit of a break during my day, and I saw this small placard that said, "This used to be the bawdy house." That's what they called brothels and gambling places
mm-hmm.
that Odessa Madre, the DC Al Capone, lived. And I thought, wow, this woman's so fascinating. And she just stayed in my mind for a while, and that's when I said I got to do something more. And that's how I feel she is with me right now. I want to do
Mm.
something more. I want to continue the conversation about her. I just am not sure what it looks like.
I don't know. I'm thinking The Godfather in my head.
Right. i I know. Well, I have to say, I love that you asked about threading the needle between what is going to appeal to the masses and what isn't. And I really, I fell in love with The Godfather when I read it. And I know people have mixed feelings about it, but I just I loved it. And I read an interview with Mario Puzo,
Mm.
um, and he said, it wasn't even my favorite book. I had written a book, I think it was The Fortunate Pilgrim, and he said, that was one of my favorite books, but it wasn't being picked up. And I think he had worked for City Hall and maybe a local newspaper, but to make a long story short, he was just reading stories about gangsters in New York, and he said, you know what, I'm just going to do the lowest like hanging fruit and make this book about, the Corleone family, and look at how successful. I mean, look at what a legend he
Yeah.
became.
And you
And
think people
so
will go to him and say, "Hey, you just glorify a criminal"?
that's right. That's
Probably.
right. Probably right. But it became this, and he's one person I wish, if he was still alive, I would definitely love to pick his brain just about the writing process. And he's a beautiful, beautiful writer.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. Well,
Yeah.
this is a fascinating chat that we're having,
Mhm.
and I really love it. I can see a lot of things that in you that I kind of feel the same way. Like when you're like,
Oh,
it's like when I do something, I don't like to script anything because I'm not good at
yes.
memorizing things. I like to just
Yes.
go loose.
Hmm.
And even the interviews, I know how to talk with my Italian
Hmm.
accent and mistakes here and there. My wife makes fun of me all the time, but I'm like, yeah, but I think about what I say, not how I say
Yeah.
it that much, and
Yes.
I can get away with a murder
You,
with
you,
that,
you
right?
kind of can't, honestly, because when you have like an Italian
I
accent,
have an
French accent, British
excuse.
accent, people love it though. It honestly, it has a lot of
I hope
cachet
so.
here.
I hope so.
It
But
does.
and with you with these fascinating stories, I really want to know what you're gonna do next. I want to see what you do next,
Thank you.
and I want you to come back and have
Thank you.
more moments to share stories with me if you would like to.
Thank you.
And I hope that people appreciate it. These short, hey, 30 minutes. See how fast they go,
It
right?
goes by so fast. Yeah, thank you, Marco. I really appreciate it. I would absolutely love that.
Yeah,
And I would love people to come to, they can go to my website and
yeah.
see my films at aroundrobin.com and just see what I do and the stories that I like to tell. And you totally get it. You
Yeah.
understand.
Well, I think your stories were fascinating. The people that you portrayed in your stories are also fascinating. And
Thank you.
I will obviously be more than happy to, and I will put all the
Mhm.
links to your website
Oh, thank
in
you.
the notes. And I invite people to learn more about you and what you do. And leave us your feedback
Mhm.
if you have their own experience in telling stories and if you agree with what we said or not. If you don't agree, we didn't do it. But if you agree, we did.
That's right. That's right. Or just don't leave a comment.
We didn't do it. We didn't do it.
That's
All right.
right.
Thank you, everybody. Stay tuned for another Audio Signals podcast coming to you soon. And Robin, thank you very much for spending time with me.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure, Marco. Thank you.
Sean,
Marco,
we are here to deliver a message from the RSA conference team.
it's an important message from our friends. RSA Conference 2025, just around the corner, where insights drive action, solutions emerge, and community connections spark innovation. You'll be there. I'll be there. We invite everybody else to be there April 28th through May 1st. You can secure your spot at rsaconference.com/ITSPMAG25. That's ITSPMAG25. See you all there.
I'll be there. See you there.